Joining me now is Mary McCord herself, former acting assistant attorney general for national security. She's now the executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and a professor at the Georgetown University Law Center. Ms. McCord, thanks so much for joining me tonight. Let me just first ask you, given your background and where we are right now, do you see these attempts to intimidate voters and monitor drop boxes? Is this a domestic terrorism 2.0?
Well, I think it's a national security threat, right? Because these are threats to the very core of our democracy. These are threats to people's ability to feel safe voting. That is actually participating directly in our democratic processes. And if our democracy fails, if we do not have assurance that people can safely vote, if people don't have confidence in the ability to go vote, if they don't have confidence in the fact that their votes will be counted, they might quit participating, or they might be too intimidated to participate. And that is when democracy fails. And that's a national security threat because that affects the U.S.'s, presence in the world. It historically has been looked up to as a real beacon of democracy. And that's partly, why we have been successful economically and so militarily and in so many other ways. So, yes, it's about domestic extremism, but it's not just a domestic problem in my mind.
When you drill into the national security threat that this poses, I'm interested to understand better how these groups that used to operate at a broader national level, like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, have reorganized and retrenched for the battle that lies ahead in November. Can you talk a little bit about that, how these chapters have changed in the years and months since January 6th?
Yeah, and I think it was largely a reaction to January 6th, right? In the immediate aftermath, there was incredible attention on some of these groups and many of their members, at least with respect to the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters, have had significant numbers of people charged with crimes. And we have a seditious conspiracy trial going on right now in Washington, D.C. against members of the Oath Keepers. So there was a need to kind of put on a new face and change their strategy. And so we did see some of the national organizations dismember sort of at that national disband, I should say, at that national level in favor of local chapters. But it doesn't mean that there's not a national strategy. There's just not like a single puppet master running it. What we've got is a decentralized, localized, very grassroots effort. And I think your clip of Michael Flynn explained it very well. I used a different example with the mayors, focus on county over country, capture your county, then a few, then maybe your state. But Michael Flynn said essentially the same thing last week or earlier this week in Pennsylvania about getting in at that precinct level. And mind you, the same disinformation about the 2020 election that fueled the violence on January 6, 2021. That is the same disinformation today, nearly 2 years after the 2020 election, that is fueling all of these efforts to intimidate voters, to threaten and intimidate election officials, and to try to thwart people from exercising their fundamental constitutional rights to vote. And that's why it really is going to take a strong response. I mean, part of the reason for talking about this publicly is not to give attention to the bad guys, but to put them on notice. What they're doing is illegal. It is a crime. It is a crime under federal law. It's a crime under state law. It's not protected by the First Amendment. It's not protected by the Second Amendment.
As you talk to people about this, you were at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. How, for lack of a better term, how on top of this are they?
Well, I think it's been, many mayors and police chiefs, sheriffs, they know what's happening right in their jurisdiction, but I don't think they always see how what's happening in their own community might fit into the bigger picture. And also, they don't always realize what tools might be available, what strategies might be available to combat this. And so one of the things that I was doing along with former police chief Chuck Ramsey on Monday was trying to, sort of provide a threat picture for what those of us who are working with private researchers who are paying attention to what's going on around across the country, what we're seeing in terms of coordinated activity. And even again, there's no one central coordinator, as your intro very aptly showed. You have lots of different organizations, but they're all marching kind of the same direction, and they're all encouraging these localized efforts. And so for both law enforcement officials and public officials of different, local level, state level, federal level, to have a good understanding of that. Helps them be able to direct different countermeasures, if you will, one of which is really in every local jurisdiction. You need to be preparing now, and you need to be talking with the community. That means your local law enforcement, your public officials, your voting rights activists, the parties. You need to be getting on the same page with respect to protecting elections and protecting election workers, and making strong statements about the illegality of voter intimidation. It's not always going to be appropriate to send law enforcement to polling places, because in some jurisdictions that can be even more intimidating than them not being there. So that's why you need to make decisions on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. And of course, in some places, law enforcement is part of the problem. We have a constitutional sheriffs movement right now, which is a fringe group of sheriffs that believe they're the highest law of the land, subject to no other authority, and they are starting to meddle in election administration. So that's another thing for people to be aware of and election officials to know. If a constitutional sheriff comes knocking and starting to ask a lot of questions about election administration, go talk to your city attorney or your district attorney or your attorney general about what really authority under your state law does a sheriff have, because some of them are trying to overstep.
The constitutional sheriff's movement is a frightening movement in the context of everything else that's happening right here. But let me just ask you one more question about what voters can actually do if they are in the middle of this, if they are dropping off a ballot, if they are at the polls. I mean, what practically is the correct countermeasure if a voter feels like he or she is being threatened?
I mean, they should be reporting it. I mean, what we do not want to do by calling attention to this is to dissuade voters from voting. I mean, quite the opposite. But if they learn about things, or they see or experiencing things like people following them to their cars, taking note of their license plates, videotaping them, dropping their ballots, asking them any types of questions about their qualifications, providing misleading statements about suggesting maybe that, they might be committing a crime if they're depositing more than one ballot. And to be clear, that is not a violation of federal law to deposit ballots for other people. It's not a violation of most state laws as well. So, they need to understand that when they see this type of activity, they should be reporting it. They should be reporting it to local election officials or law enforcement or the Department of Justice, whoever they feel comfortable reporting it to.
Vote and report. That is my takeaway from all of this. Mary McCord, former acting assistant attorney general for national security and now the executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and a professor at the Georgetown University Law Center. Ms. McCord, thank you so much for your time tonight.